Hey co-stars, welcome to another episode of Generation Films. My name is British Ben, and today we are going to cover 10 more secret features of the Enterprise D in Star Trek. Now in this video, you're not going to see things that you already know, like the dolphins, the yoga studio, the slide between decks 10 and 11. Okay, that last one's not a thing, but we covered many of those things in our previous video on our Generation Tech channel. But I have been scouring the technical manual and obscure websites for some extra secret features that you may not know about. So here is 10 more secret features of the Enterprise D in Star Trek. Number 1, it had Wi-Fi. So Star Trek The Next Generation came out in 1997 and the technical manual came out in 1991. The first Wi-Fi, however, didn't debut on the scene until 1997, but it seems the writers were ahead of their time because they worked into the show a short-range radio frequency network aboard the ship where devices such as pads, personal communicators, and tricorders could communicate with the ship. Take the pad, for example. That's pad with a double D. I think there's a joke in there somewhere. I can't think of anything. It's basically a prediction of the iPad that would come to be 20 years later. A personal tablet that, just like touchscreen control panels aboard the Enterprise, could be configured in any way you want. You could even configure helm controls on the pad and it could connect with the ship via the short-range radio frequency network, so you could literally pilot the ship whilst you schmoozed with fantasy women on the holodeck, for example. The pad's subspace transceiver assembly could also communicate with the ship from greater distances, so it could be taken on away missions. The pad had a memory capacity of 4.3 kiloquads, and this is interesting because what does quads mean or kiloquads mean? No one actually knows. So they made up these measurements called quads, kiloquads, and gigaquads to measure memory. But they wanted to avoid the sort of embarrassing scenario where 10 gigabytes would sound like a big hard drive in the early 90s. But how big's my hard drive? Oh, it's a terabyte. That's 1,000 gigabytes. So say in the early 90s, they picked out a big sounding number like 100 gigabytes. Whoa, that's huge. Well, I'm sitting on 1,000 gigabytes and it's nowhere near the 24th century. So they invented this system to avoid that awkwardness as technology progressed at such a fast rate. Number 2. Saucer section deflector. Now, if you watch Star Trek, you'll know about the navigational deflector. This is separate from the deflector shields, which are to deflect weapons fire, but the navigational deflector was on deck 34 and it sent out a graviton polarity beam to deflect small objects in space, such as small asteroids or even objects as small as space dust and stray hydrogen atoms. At high warp velocities, even a single atom could do damage to the ship. But did you know that the saucer section actually had its own navigational deflector to be used in separated flight mode? Look, there it is there. I bet you thought that was just some windows, didn't you? But no, that is the saucer section deflector, which up close looks like this. It's a lot smaller than the main deflector because the saucer section was not capable of warp flight. It is described as being made up of fixed focus medium power units. It could also serve as a backup deflector when the main deflector was offline, although probably not at warp speeds. Number 3, empty space. The Enterprise is designed for comfortable living. Ship's quarters give crew members about 360 square feet of living space per person, which is actually huge. But it's not just the quarters. If you look at the habitable area of the ship overall and then divide that by the number of crew members, which is just over 1,000, it's actually a huge amount of space per person. E.C. Henry did a video where he worked out that the Enterprise D has 8.9 million square feet of habitable space, which means that each person on board would have 824 square feet all to themselves, which is crazy. He worked out that you'd have to walk an average of 91 feet before bumping into another person in the corridor, and that's if everyone was out and about walking at the same time. Now, this isn't entirely accurate because remember, some areas of the ship would only be accessible to senior staff members, and also decks 9, 11, 33, and 35 were left intentionally unoccupied, with those crew quarters on those decks in reserve for specific missions where extra personnel were required. But in general, it was very empty. The technical manual says that there are enough crew quarters on board the Enterprise to house 6,500 people, and in emergency situations, the ship could carry 15,000 people with shuttle bays and cargo bays converted into living quarters. And by converted, we mean converted into a farm configuration. So the standard complement of the Enterprise was way under the ship's maximum capacity, but there is more. In addition to crew members and barnyards, there's actually just empty space. If you look at the blueprints, there are these areas that are just labeled future expansion, and there's just nothing there. And I guess that does make sense. With a huge starship that's gonna serve in Starfleet for a long time, you would want to leave some areas empty for future upgrades, like additional scientific equipment or weapon systems, or maybe just larger poker rooms. And speaking of poker and enjoying oneself in general, that brings us to our next one. Number 4, lounges. Now I love this American Express card. It gets me into all of the airport lounges. I wonder if there's a card like that for use aboard the Enterprise, because they had a lot of very comfortable lounges on board. I'm sure you all know 10 Forward, that trendy bar restaurant where the portions are massive.
I'll have 10 chocolate sundaes.
The drinks are disgusting.
I hate this. It is revolting.
And they have a weekly WrestleMania night where anyone can join in. But in addition to 10 Forward, the Enterprise D was actually supposed to have a load of other lounges. The designer of the ship, Andrew Probert, said that he put a lot of windows on the model that were kind of earmarked to be lounges. Here's what he said in an interview in 2005. "I designed those decks as a nice, comfortable place where they could simply go and relax. They were simply lounges. They were different size, ranging from 2-person lounge to a 14-person lounge, where you could have family gatherings or parties, and they would all be very darkly lit so you wouldn't get gross window reflections, allowing you to see outside a lot easier." Probert drew concept art to design a lot of these lounges. Look, this is a 2-person lounge, which we did actually see in the first episode of the show, Encounter at Farpoint, but the set used was a redress of Beverly Crusher's office. These windows here on Deck 2 were also supposed to be a lounge called 2 Forward, like 10 Forward, but with the windows facing up instead of down. Here's what that would look like, and there would also be 9 Forward, which is in the same position as 10 Forward, but on the upper side of the saucer so the windows face up. Interestingly, in addition to the lounges, on the original blueprints by Ed Whiteface, he placed a 5-deck high mall in the forward section of the saucer near 10 Forward. And it makes sense that you would have a mall on the Enterprise, just like you have the promenade in Deep Space Nine where people can go to buy stuff. But how do you have a mall in a world where no one has any money?
Money doesn't exist in the 24th century.
Number 5, fire suppression force field. So all large buildings that host large numbers of people by law have to have sprinkler systems. But the Enterprise goes one step further, and it has a system of fire sensors and fire suppression force fields. When the computer detects gases from combustion of a fire, it enacts a force field around that fire, cutting it off from the atmosphere of the ship. Basically, the fire uses up all the oxygen within the force field, and then it just goes out. At least that's the way it's supposed to work. Number 6, escape pods. You never see the escape pods on the Enterprise D in the series or the movies, but the ship did have 400 escape pods, which they call lifeboats. These lifeboats can carry up to 6 people. So if the ship was operating at the maximum crew capacity of 6,500, you would have a Titanic-like situation where people on the lower decks didn't get a boat. But at 1,000 people on board, you would only need 166 lifeboats to carry the entire crew. The lifeboats are 3-meter cubes that are capable of atmospheric entry. In space, they have full life support for 86 man days, so if the boat was full with 6 people on board, you could survive for 14 days in space. Another cool feature of the lifeboats is gaggle mode, where many boats could link up. They could dock together and open their hatches so that crew members could move between different modules. It's kind of like the modular design of those primitive space stations that we have now, for example. Although we never see the lifeboats on the Enterprise D, we do see them on the Enterprise E in the movie First Contact. They're a slightly different triangular design. Number 7, 100-year operational life. Galaxy-class starships like the Enterprise D are expected to have a 100-year operational lifetime. This explains why we still see Excelsior-class starships from Kirk and Spock's era in the Next Generation, because they have an incredibly long operational life too. In that 100-year lifetime, the Enterprise is expected to dock at starbases some 200 times for upgrades and modifications. so that's roughly once every 6 months. Funnily enough, the Enterprise D was supposedly too big to fit through the doors of the Starbase model that had been used for earlier movies. Andrew Probert had originally drawn a concept of it docking outside the Starbase, but this was thrown out by the studio. When the Enterprise docks, there are connections down the spine of the ship for taking on supplies such as food, fuel, wiper fluid. There are also docking ports on the bottom of the saucer and also airlocks either side of the neck of the ship. But if you were a bridge officer, you didn't need to go down to the airlock on deck 25. No. The turbolift shaft located at the bridge could link up to the turbolift system of the Starbase. So turbolift cars from the Enterprise could seamlessly pass into the turbolift system and back. Anyway, during its 100-year lifespan, a Galaxy-class ship goes through several major refits and upgrades. At the beginning, it's a lot of more smaller upgrades, maybe once, twice, 3 times a year, but once the ship's systems are considered mature, they've ironed out the kinks and glitches, the ship goes through major upgrades and refits every 20 years. And these could consist of swapping out an entire computer core, for example, and usually the ship would be taken out of service for up to a year whilst the upgrade is completed. Number 8, atmospheric systems for multiple planets. Although the Enterprise maintained an atmosphere on board similar to an M-class planet, that would be 78% nitrogen, 21% oxygen, and 1% other trace gases, same as Earth, 10% of the crew quarters on board could be switched to Class H, K, and L atmospheric conditions. Class H planets were uninhabitable to humans and were inhabited by creatures that looked like this. It's nice that the Enterprise was such a welcoming place for their guests. Then Class K planets were only habitable to humans inside biospheres, and Class L were deemed marginally habitable for humans. I always think it would be funny that you go around to some Anson's quarters to play poker, and then after a few minutes you start choking because you forgot their atmospheric conditions were set to Class K. An additional 2% of the crew quarters could also be converted to Class N planet conditions, which consisted of high temperatures, a lot of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and lower gravity. An example of a Class N planet in our solar system would be Venus, not habitable to humans. Number 9, phaser practice range. All officers on board the Enterprise are issued Type 1 phasers as personal defensive weapons. These are the less powerful of the 2 handheld phasers and have just 8 power settings. Type 2 phasers have an additional 8 settings for a total of 16 power settings, and they are used on away missions and during alert conditions. Then you also have phaser rifles, which are used for taking out even bigger threats, like the Borg, for example. All personnel on the Enterprise are required to train on the phaser range once every 4 months in order to maintain their proficiency, and away team candidates are required to train at least once a month to maintain a higher level of proficiency with the weapon. This was done on dedicated phaser ranges on board the Enterprise with a modified version of the Type 1 phaser, which had a maximum power setting of level 3. Phaser rifle training, however, could only take place on a starbase. For some reason, Worf can be seen in the show breaking the rules of the phaser range with a Type 2 phaser.
I practiced at level 14.
Maybe that's why he always misses in battle. Too much emphasis on power, not enough accuracy. Alright, now for our last secret feature of the Enterprise D. Number 10, a removable bridge. The bridge on the Galaxy-class starship was much more luxurious than previous bridges. This was to show that 100 years had passed since the time of Kirk and Spock. It also had less workstations due to increased automation. In some of the original concept art for the bridge, Andrew Probert drew couches where crew members could hold meetings, and one concept also had a balcony looking down from above. Although these things weren't incorporated into the final bridge design, they could be on future bridges because, according to the technical manual, the bridge was completely removable and the bridge module would be replaced every 20 years. It could also be replaced with mission-specific bridges for certain types of missions. We do see a bridge upgrade when we get to Star Trek Generations, the movie, with extra workstations and steps leading up to the command chest. This presumably was after a complete bridge replacement. Alright guys, that's the video for today, and if you want to do what we do, earn money by talking about fictional spacecraft and any other topic for that matter on YouTube, do check out our new course, YouTube Viral Mastery. It's a course on how my business partner and I built 9 YouTube channels with over 2 million subscribers. It's been a heck of a ride thanks to you guys. So if you're an aspiring YouTuber, as a free preview of the course, just click below and check out our masterclass on how to build a 6-figure YouTube channel without making all the silly mistakes we made along the way. Interested? Check out the details below. Please subscribe to our channel if you're new, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.